Hello and welcome to another episode of Decoding Bias. I'm your host, Dr. Ezra Taferra, and today we have a special guest, Sarah Goldberg. Sarah is completing her MPP or Master's in Public Policy at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management, where she focuses on gender bias and AI with diverse backgrounds in both the legal field and academia. She brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to our discussion today, which is going to be on the intersections of gender, law, and technology. So Sarah, thank you for joining us today. And let's dive in and hear more about your fascinating journey and your work on gender biases on AI. So could you start by briefly introducing yourself and giving us a brief overview of your background, what inspired you to do the research that you are doing right now in the intersections of AI and technology policy? Just give us a brief background about that.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. As you mentioned, I have a legal background. I was working in the legal field for around 10 years, and sort of my life experiences led me, and my work experiences led me to want to go back to school for policy. And I knew that I wanted to focus on women, gender, and sexuality studies with a particular focus on politics. And I sort of fell into the AI space accidentally. About 2 years ago when ChatGPT was released, my husband, who is a data scientist and an engineer, sort of came to me with this concerns about it. And while his concerns were really more related to the future of work, which are my concerns as well, I was really interested in how these systems were put together, how they were trained. Like they're these incredible, supposedly brain-like systems. Well, what information are they trained on? And how will our society's proclivities, the biases that exist, also exist in those systems? Wonderful.
I know you have worked with Professor Anita Hill, who is a powerhouse. And you must have been incredibly excited about working with her.
Intimidated.
Also intimidated. But that experience is truly inspiring, right? And how did her mentorship influence your research directions, particularly in exploring gender biases in AI, and how that shaped your view on the research?
Yeah, so totally a joke. Dr. Anita Hill is incredible, obviously, and an enthusiastic yes. Her to all of that. Her mentorship has been so significant for me personally in sort of shaping the directions that I feel like I can take, professionally and in this space. So I'm forever grateful for her for the time she's given me. She is also an incredible professor. She forces you to ask and to think more deeply about your work, to think more critically about it, and how the work you're doing fits into the greater good. And so I went to her with a simple hypothesis about these biases existing in LLMs, and she got me through the outcomes of this research to understand that really it was about the threat to our democratic systems. So she's just an incredible influence in many ways.
I'm sure Anita is an incredible influence. She's such an inspirational person, and someone that I personally look up to. Can you say a little bit more about how this experience, as well as your personal experience and your backgrounds, shaped your approach in researching and understanding AI biases?
So that's such a good question. I didn't really have a background in artificial intelligence at all. So that's sort of accidentally happened. I did, however, feel like I had a decent grasp on gender biases. And so that's sort of how I began, by looking at their manifestations, and then creating this bias taxonomy that highlighted how these biases manifested in the real world, and then sort of took that, or I should say in the real world as it relates to political candidates, and then took that into my research into AI. So it was really sort of the happenstance of this, this new technology being released, and the interest that my work was like already there before. If that makes sense.
Yes, that definitely makes sense. We would definitely talk about that taxonomy.
Okay.
I really want to hone in on that a little bit later. But before we do that, just so that we can have like a basic context, we keep on saying the word bias, algorithmic bias. Mm-hmm. So can you explain what an AI bias is to you, and why it's significant or a significant threat or concern, especially when it comes to issues of fairness and equity?
AI bias can be many things, and it can manifest itself in so many ways. So it exists in the data that we have. It exists in the how our data is being used, the lack of transparency into what is AI generated content, and then of course, like in the algorithms, the way that the machines, like the decision making behind the machines, their objective functions, how they're trained. And since AI is used everywhere already, it's a concern nearly everywhere: healthcare, housing, banking, and because not only now are potentially are these biased decisions being made anyway, right? If human to human interactions are biased, but there's even less accountability for them because of the automated decisions that are being made, the lack of transparency, etc.
I totally agree with that. In a previous episode, I was discussing with Dean Madison on how people perceive AI to be just a machine, but there is a human behind the machine. So we cannot just neglect that fact, right? You put it really eloquently. I just want you to give me perhaps a real world example of how this AI biases manifest. You mentioned the fields. Just can you give us how these biases manifest, and particularly how these biases impact marginalized communities?
Sure. So I think that like crime prediction software is a really, basic example of how these biases manifest. So there was a particular software called Predpol, and this has been used in dozens of police departments across the US. And it relied on an algorithm to predict where officers should increase their patrolling. And it was later revealed that this targeted communities of color for increased patrol at a much higher rate than white communities. And this is because the algorithm relied on previous crime report data or arrests to make future crime predictions. So algorithms don't have nuanced understandings of things like racial profiling. Algorithms don't have nuanced understandings that white crime victims are actually less likely to report violent crimes than Black or Latino victims. So the more arrests that the algorithm could see, the more it predicted future arrests. And this resulted in higher patrol rates in these communities of color. And of course, this led to more arrests and perpetuated a biased crime prediction system. So this is like a very, basic understanding of the way that the model was trained. It was trained without being critically thought through.
And the data inclusivity is a huge issue when we come to the carceral system, how these facial recognition technologies are being deployed and used. That's a wonderful point to raise. Now, I want to connect this with your personal project, your capstone project, which is really fascinating. It's titled Fair Futures, Steering AI Towards Equity. So I believe this builds from your previous research, and it uses that as a foundation. So what motivated you to explore more or delve deeper into AI biases, and how did your earlier work, perhaps your earlier project with gender biases and ChatGPT, influence this project?
Yeah, such a good question. So, as I said before, working with Professor Hill had a big influence on my work. And sort of when our initial paper came to fruition, I realized that this was more about a threat to our democratic systems than it was about finding a particular bias in a particular large language model. And so it wasn't so much, I mean, I found a lot of intersectionality in the biases and the outcomes of this work, which is, I think for someone who's in policy is an obvious finding. So I really became more interested in not just this one system, but in all the ways that AI creates bias and discriminatory outcomes. And that can be not just from our influence on the systems, like our bias data creates bias systems, but also, like I said, the lack of transparency, the data itself, how that data can be used used against us in discriminatory ways. And then also on the objective function, which is what we just talked about, the training of the model, how that model is trained, what its objective function is, if it's not thought about critically, can also lead to bias outcomes. So I started to try to think more about all the different avenues of bias as opposed to just a single model.
And that's how we should also view AI, right?
Yes.
As you mentioned earlier, it's everywhere.
Yes.
We have to have a systemic approach to how we understand, identify, and mitigate the issues from the technology as well as utilizing the positive aspects of the technology equitably.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
So I'm going to come back to the conversation about taxonomy and the taxonomy that you created. So in your research with Professor Hill, you created a taxonomy of gender biases and tested AI responses with subtle changes like pronouns. Mm-hmm. So can you share some of the most striking findings from this study? Perhaps what implications they have for how we design and use AI?
I think the most striking finding was how innate the biases were, which was part of the goal of the project. It wasn't to try and poke and prod the model and, try to get it to say the most, hateful things. It was to see really how those subtle changes can make a difference in how it answered me, what the outcome was. And there was a lot of benevolent sexism when it comes to gender biases in particular. I found a lot of benevolent sexism, which I'm sure you're familiar with that. But for those who aren't, on like the Glick and Fisk ambivalent sexism scale, benevolent sexism is things like, putting women on a pedestal, thinking that women are more empathetic or believe certain things, they need to be cherished and cared for, right? So the fact that these biases existed in the model means, which they do in society as well, but if they're so innate in the model that they're being fed back to us, over and over again, all it's doing is, again, perpetuating that bias without critical thinking involved, and perpetuating a bias system. So
that's exactly how I view it as well. When we think about these technologies, we also have to think about who designs them and how diverse those teams are.
Yes.
any personal implicit biases are going to be manifested in these technologies. So that's a wonderful way of seeing it and expressing it. So you mentioned about transparency. I think transparency is a very concerning issue in AI development. Can you say more about that?
I think so. I think there's the transparency that we all think of, like even, and there are some states right now in terms of policy that are working on making things more transparent, requiring watermarking, saying this is AI generated content. Deep fakes and things are being used against people all over the internet. These are, very obvious transparency issues. I think, the things that people don't think about is when they apply for a job interview or a job, or they apply for a housing application. There are a lot of these systems being used already to weed out people, to say, like, for example, in a job application, we only want people from these specific neighborhoods. That's already, a bias level. And so I think there's lack of transparency in knowing how these systems are working. And without that sort of human in the loop at each phase of this to think critically about what's being put in front of them, the actual resume that's being put in front of them, we're losing something. So, and, again, humans have bias. That's something we need to be continuously working on, but it's the lack of transparency and that automation that I see as excessively problematic.
This resonates with what Dean Madison from our earlier episode was also mentioning, how these technologies, how these algorithms are being employed in hiring algorithms or lending algorithms. And these have just been amplifying the systemic disparities that are already existing. So pulling you back to the conversation of your capstone, how did you identify and categorize these different types of gender biases in AI? Let's start with that.
So a lot of research. And because I was focused on specifically what I called the fictional US political candidates, that's what I was trying to, in my prompts to ChatGPT, I was asking it about, fictional political candidates and said, you are a voter or you are a candidate running for office, describe yourself, or whatever the case may be. And so I ended up doing a lot of research, a lot of political science research. And fortunately, there are so many brilliant people working in that field who have written a lot about the biases that exist, and also looking at bias research, like things like the ambivalent sexism scale, just trying to weed out what these different biases looked like. There's a lot of overlap in them, obviously. But I created a taxonomy. I think there were maybe about a dozen different types of biases: perception bias, competence bias, electability bias. So I took biases in general, gender biases in general, and then I narrowed it down because I was looking at that political focus onto competence bias, electability bias, and perception bias, because those were the most common themes. And because Dr. Hill says, you can't boil the ocean. You have to look at things a piece at a time.
I agree. Were there any particular biases perhaps that were challenging to uncover?
Yeah, electability bias was the most challenging, even though it was so important. And so I kept it in the research because it's so important. But electability bias is sort of an intangible bias. Mm-hmm. And in the US, it has a particular flavor. So I'm sure there are electability biases that exist and change all over the world. But in the US, we really have this sort of this we kind of equate our electability with somebody who might be what we call like, I'm one of you. I'm, like there have been surveys where people say, oh, I like this guy because and I say guy because it's been historically male. This is somebody I'd like to have a beer with. And so that's sort of intangible bias that we can't really put our finger on, was really hard to gauge in the model. Now, we did see some of it. We did see the models give outputs that would say things like one of you, or a good example is that the word American was used much more frequently to describe the male outputs than it was the female outputs. So there were little microaggressions within the outputs of the model that showed us electability bias, but it was definitely the hardest to pick out, and it intersects with all the others as well.
That's really insightful. The challenge is not just debunking the bias or uncovering the bias, right? Mitigating the bias is also going to be a very challenging task. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the biggest challenges that you have encountered in your efforts to identify and mitigate these biases?
I think that we are our biggest challenge. I think that uncovering these biases and even, figuring out ways to regulate these biases is completely doable. I think, though, that we're in this innovation race and we are afraid to slow down and ask ourselves what these AI systems, what exposure is there in using these systems? What is the harm that's being done? We're sort of unwilling to do that hard work. And so I think we're our biggest challenge.
Can you say a little bit more about that, and then also talk about what policy measures you believe are most critical to ensure that AI is used ethically and equitably?
So let me start with the second part first. I think all pieces are critical, but I'd say the first thing that we need to regulate, not the most critical, but the first, is the data and making sure our data is protected. Other countries are doing this already, although not as well as they could. We need to be having, worldwide, I believe there should be an opt-in system versus an opt-out system. And by that, I mean that the first line of defense is that all your data is protected and you have to click on a button if you want to share your data. And I think that is the most critical. There were so many interesting policies to analyze. I was really looking at it from a place of what is going to mitigate discrimination the most, protect the most vulnerable the most. And so there was a lot of overlap, but I think the biggest, I think the reason that I chose the one that I did, the AI bill by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, is because it encompassed all the pieces that we need. It encompassed the data protection. It had the development and deployment of the model included in the regulation, so that every step of the system had humans in the loop who could better understand the needs of, or where a disparate impact may occur at each phase of the, like I said, either the creation of the model or the deployment of the model, but that there was, and one of the things that I added to the bill was to include offices from, like, government offices like the EEOC, Housing and Urban Development, so that those people who specifically look at those issues, who can better understand how they might affect those communities, are the ones analyzing how those impacts may be occurring.
You also saw regulations from other countries, not just the US. The European Union is one of them. And there are other regulations that are underway, perhaps also even a little bit a step ahead than the regulations that we have here in the US, such as the ones that Japan has and others too. Since AI is a global phenomenon, it requires a global attention. Do you think there is going to be any way that these global actors can come together and formulate a global regulation?
Wow, that's such a good question. I don't really have an answer for that. I would have to really put some thought work into that to give you a thoughtful answer. I would say though that, to me, it's important. You've hit the nail on the head, which is that it is a global phenomenon. There aren't borders with artificial intelligence, and so we do need to make it. A global effort. Will we? I don't know.
So fingers crossed.
Yes,
let's hope so.
Well, hopefully more than fingers crossed.
Yes.
I mean, like you said, there are countries who are already working on this, and I think the more that it becomes a part of people's everyday lives, the more pressing it is going to feel, and it will affect everyone at some point.
It's already affecting everyone, I believe.
Yes.
For me, I think it still is the idea of technological supremacy and the race to attain that. That is going to be the most challenging thing for any government to come together and work on this as a global entity. The race between the US government and China, the heavy investment on developing a much more advanced and perhaps more powerful AI tools, or perhaps to attain AGI, that is going to be a challenge for regulation.
Yes.
We are putting more emphasis on advancing the technology and investing more on that, while we are perhaps neglecting the social impact and the regulation that needs to be in place.
Absolutely.
So how do you see your research influencing these policy decisions and perhaps to promote fairness and equity in AI?
I feel like no one is an expert on this yet. I feel like
I agree with you.
I feel like this is a community effort. And so I just see myself as being part of the community. And when I, when I researched the AI bill by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, I thought, wow, this is so well put together. But it was being looked at with a legal perspective. And I will say they must have had some incredible AI experts working with them as well, because they had what I felt was all of the necessary pieces in there. But I was looking at it from a policy perspective. So I thought about, what is this going to look like when it gets to Congress? How are we what about the unintended policy consequences of this? And how can we protect small businesses? How can we include protections for minors so that not just because that's super important, but also because that gives it more political feasibility. So I think just a policy perspective is, maybe where I'm adding some value. But again, I see this as a community, a global effort. So
you are seeing it both from the individual point of view as well as the community. Absolutely. But what roles can individuals and community play in this?
I think that companies, corporations already have the ability to put those people in place, those humans in the loop, in their systems, so that they can, sort of hold themselves accountable, sort of start creating those spaces. But I think we need more sort of grassroots sort of community building around this. I think that people don't realize how much this is already affecting them. I think that people don't realize how much of their data is already being used. I think, the average person might think about it when they're looking on Amazon and all of a sudden, oh, look, here are some recommendations for you. Or you're talking about something with your significant other, and then all of a sudden all these ads start popping up. But people don't really, think about that on a deeper level. And so I think that there needs to be more grassroots activism. We need to start talking about this as, like you said, as a global problem.
Yes. I think as a policy school, the Heller School should also take the vanguard to disseminate this knowledge,
Yes.
To create a more community-facing engagement, to spread the information about these technologies, what they mean, how they can impact us, especially as it relates to policy. So, having said that, balancing the ethical questions with practicality is always going to be a challenge. So how do you balance the need for ethical considerations in AI with the practical challenge of implementing a fair and unbiased AI systems?
Yeah. I think I would go back to protections for our small businesses. I think that these regulation efforts can be tiered so that you are regulating these conglomerate services first, like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, all these big companies, which small businesses leverage their frameworks anyway. So you regulate them first, and you add incentives for small businesses, and you add positions in government that are monitoring and overseeing these systems, and you're creating jobs in the meantime. So there are lots of ways that we can say, look, this is a positive thing. We can help protect our economy, which I think is what the government is always concerned about, and also do this really good work. I feel like one of the big conversations that's happening is about what AI is going to do to the future of work. And so we can turn that conversation around too and say, but here are all these jobs that we're creating by regulating this and being smart about this. So
we need to demonstrate how regulating is not going to affect perhaps innovation.
Exactly.
Right? It's not going to impede, but rather complement innovation.
Exactly.
That's wonderfully put. So for researchers, early career researchers and students interested in AI and understanding in AI bias, fairness, what advice would you give them to make a meaningful impact in the field?
To not get discouraged, because this field can be very overwhelming, and there's news about it changing every day. So the first thing I would say is don't be discouraged. Reach out to your community. Like we said, nobody is an expert in this. So learn from each other. That's what I hope to do. We need to not be bogged down by the creators of these systems, these so-called AI experts who say, we have all the knowledge, and, this is the way we're going to run things. This is the way we're going to regulate ourselves. It's sort of like, at Heller, we talk a lot about looking at things through researching through an anti-racist lens. And I think AI is no different. But then on top of that, we need to add this anti-expert lens, right? Which is a very similar kind of idea, which is that just because there are people who are experts in this field, just because it's an unknown field, doesn't mean that others don't have important things to say. So I would say everybody's voice matters in this. Just don't get discouraged and keep learning from your.
Exactly. Having that wholesome approach, right, is the best way. Having ethicists, having the community voices that are going to be impacted, or the end users.
Exactly.
Having philosophers, policymakers, lawyers, everybody should have a stake in this. Everybody should have a seat on the table in order for us to learn from each other and develop something that works for all of us. Thank you for mentioning that. So I would ask you what your vision is for this technology. I mean, what kind of future where AI systems are designed and implemented in ways that can truly serve communities and equitably serve communities do you see happening?
I think there are so many ways to go about this. I don't know what the future of AI is going to look like. I don't know what the regulation is going to look like, but I do think that AI can be a democratizing force as long as we are not keeping the power in the hands of the few. I think that it's super important that the public, like you said, has a stake in this and helps to decide what direction that's going to take.
Yes. So. Access to this technology, transparency on this technology,
yes,
the equity aspect of things, viewing and understanding this technology from a lens of equity. I think that's very important.
Absolutely.
So, final reflections. Is there anything else that you would like to share about your work, your journey, your hopes for social equity, not just AI, but particularly in AI?
You know, we talk about the challenges of AI a lot, but I think this also provides us with an opportunity to broaden the scope of what's considered discrimination and what's acceptable under the law. So I think that there's a lot of room here to grow if we do it the right way. And someone I greatly admire says that while it's sometimes hard to be optimistic, you can remain hopeful, and that's sort of where I exist, is in this hopeful, if not always optimistic space. And like I said, AI can be a democratizing force. And I just want to contribute to and collaborate with others to be a part of that particular future.
Absolutely remarkable. That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for joining us and being part of this important conversation. And thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us and tuning in. As always, until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep advocating for a brighter and a more just future. Thank you.